Hello, fellow users of the internet. So, spring is in the air. The sun is shining, the flowers are blooming, and more than likely a lot of people are suffering from hay fever. However, if you're one of the lucky few to not suffer from hay fever, then it's the perfect time to test your macro photography skills. As it is spring, I'm going to be talking about the most manly of subjects, the flower. Oh, that looked a lot better in my head. Now, typically, I'm not one of those people who likes to say that there is a way you should be doing photography. The way I see it, this is a really subjective art form or hobby, and you can do whatever you want with the camera you have and the lenses you have and the free time you have. That's none of anyone else's business. That's your business. That being said, I've seen a surprising number of uninspired photos on Instagram since I joined about a year ago. So today I'd like to give you free tips on how to, experiment and improve subjectively your own photography. Now, first things first, I'd like to get one of the biggest photography myths out of the way. You need the most expensive gear, the best gear to get good photos. And folks, as current US president would say, oh, no, I'm not even gonna go there. Fake news. One of my favorite subjects is macro photography, and specifically with flowers. And I don't use the best gear. I use a Nikon D5500, and I often use cheap used lenses. So what I do to get better photos is I use these simple techniques. So enough rambling on. The first piece of advice goes for pretty much any photo that you take, and that is you want to find an interesting subject. Now, what exactly is an interesting subject? Well, that sometimes can be a little bit, once again, subjective. But when I think about an interesting subject, I consider a few things. When it comes to flower photography, one of the fastest ways to make your photo more interesting is to find one that has something extra with it. For example, find a flower that has an insect on it. This can be a beetle or a bee that's buzzing around and collecting pollen? Is that what they collect? I don't know, I'm not a biologist? What do I look like, some kind of lexicographer? Now, that being said, this can be a little bit frustrating because, of course, you first of all have to find one with an insect, and when it comes to insects, they're not like people. You can't tell them to hold a pose. You can't tell them to look at the camera, so yeah, this does take a long time, and sometimes I'll go on a 2-hour walk, and on that entire 2-hour walk, I'll find just one flower with an insect on it. But when you find it and you get that shot, it is worth it. And the reason this will help your photo stand out is because if you have one with, let's say, an insect on it, that photo can't be recreated exactly the same way. Now, the second one is a personal preference of mine and might be a little bit controversial out there, but personally, I love imperfections. So whenever I'm out there shooting flower photos, I'm always looking for flowers that are different and have imperfections. I find this is a great way to help your subject stand out because it's different, and I find a lot of people overlook these flowers that are flawed and not perfect. Everybody is looking for that perfect subject. So go the other way and find one that has some flaws and really focus on those flaws to help it stand out, because the way I see it, imperfection is beautiful. Now, the last piece of advice is once again a very simple one, and this is to find contrast. Now, when I'm looking for contrast, I'm often looking for two colors that kind of clash. So I'm looking for like deep reds in a green, or I'm looking for pinks and yellows, colors that just really clash, and I find that this will once again help your subject stand out. Now, the second piece of advice also isn't rocket science, and that is to consider the angle and composition of your subject. I mean, this is something that you should be considering in all of your photos. That being said, despite that this is a basic fundamental of every photo you should be taking, I find that this is something that a lot of people don't take into consideration. What I mean by this is that I'll see a lot of people who just grab their camera or they grab their phone and it's just like in front of the subject, click, and then finished, done. They don't even consider anything else. They just take the photo and walk away. And if that's what you want to do, that's totally fine. Once again, this is all subjective. If that's the photo you want, that's the photo you take, that's your right. The first piece of advice is super simple, and that is you want to try shooting your subjects from different angles. Every subject looks better from a different angle. Try shooting level to the subject. So instead of shooting like this or like this, get right down and shoot from the level of the subject. Or if you can, try to get behind the subject. I find that this is a very interesting view that a lot of people don't photograph, and with some subjects it looks really good. And in some cases you just want to keep it simple and minimalistic. Don't complicate things, just keep it simple. And in some cases, it is totally fine to just shoot straight down at the photo. But once again, you want a photo that has some kind of interest in the middle, or a photo that looks interesting when it's shot top down, and not every subject is going to work this way. Regardless of what angle you're shooting at, it's important to keep your composition in mind. Sometimes you can shoot the subject right in the middle, but often it looks better when it's off to the side. So try shooting a little bit off to the side, and it'll make your photo just look a little bit better. Or in some cases, with some subjects, it looks better if you fill the frame with that subject. If you're lucky enough to find a situation where you can frame your subject using the nature around it, go ahead and frame your subject. But that brings me back to my original point that every subject is different. So you want to shoot everything a little bit differently. Don't just stick your camera in front of every flower or every subject and just hit the shutter button. Unless that's what you want to do. Once again, this is subjective. That's what you want to do, go ahead and do that. Who am I to tell you what to do? So now that we've got the simple stuff out of the way, it's time to move on to something a little more complex, and that is to consider the conditions and the light. I find this is something that a lot of people overlook. They don't really think about how the light and how the weather can affect their subject. One thing to keep in mind is that I do process my photos in Lightroom, so when I'm photographing something, and if you edit your photos as well, I would strongly recommend that you don't just look at your subject, but you visualize what it's going to look like when you've finished processing it. That being said, if you don't process your images, that's totally fine. You can still use these techniques in your raw photos. So if it's a really sunny day, you're going to want to go for something really bright, obviously, because the sunlight is bright. On the other hand, you can also go for something that's really dreamy. So in a photo like this, you want to slightly overexpose your subject, or if you're post-processing, you can raise the exposure slightly in post-processing. This will give it a nice, light, dreamy look, and it will really help to emphasize those soft colors. But wait, is the sun going down? Well, it's the perfect chance to capture a photo where the sun is hitting a subject as the light is fading. This will easily help your subject stand out from the rest of the bunch. Or if you're lucky enough, why not take a photo where the flower seems to be catching the sun? This is a little bit more difficult to capture and might be a little bit of trial and error, but once you capture it, it is a stunning image. It's very likely to get a good result on this one. You're going to have to raise some of the shadows in post-processing because the sun is so bright. It might leave your subject a little bit dark. You got some trees in the background obscuring the light. We'll use that as a backdrop. This is an excellent opportunity to get some nice light in the background, or what a lot of photographers call bokeh. So this is kind of a blurry light in the background of your subject. So if you find an opportunity where the sun is going down behind some trees, this is a perfect chance to get a bokeh macro shot. Wait, is it a cloudy day? No sunshine? Bam! Moody photography. This is one of my favorite kinds of photography to do in the summer here in Japan because it's usually cloudy. You're very likely going to want to grab a tripod. Now, if you don't have a tripod, that's totally fine. You can still do these handheld. However, you're going to want to raise your ISO a little bit because the shutter speed will be a little slower on a cloudy day. So if you want to capture a photo that's still crisp and sharp, you might have to raise your ISO a little bit. But now, worst case scenario, it rains, and if you're one of those people who'd rather stay inside and watch Netflix on a rainy day, I'm right there with you. But rainy days are a great opportunity to get some nice water droplet shots. In fact, a lot of flowers look a lot better when they're covered in water. It adds this extra element to them. If you have a longer lens, like a 300mm macro lens, then this is a great opportunity to try to use the rain as a kind of bokeh, but in front of your subject. But the point is, regardless of the weather, there is a style of photography that works for every subject. So don't let the weather get you down. Grab your camera and just experiment with different styles of photography using the elements. Now moving on to step number 4, and that's to control your aperture. Now, I don't have time to get into exactly what aperture does, but just remember that a lower number is a wider aperture and will help to isolate your subject. So this is a really great way to help pick out one subject in a sea of other subjects. If you have no idea what aperture is, don't worry, I'm planning to make a very simple video about it in the future. So until then, just remember, small number, wide aperture, isolate your subject. Try doing that in your macro photography. Piece of advice number 5 is one of my favorite things to do, and that piece of advice is to shoot through something else. Personally, I love doing this because it's a great way to frame your subject using something in the foreground. It's also a good way to add a splash of color. So once again, we can go back to contrast, and you can use a splash of color using something in the foreground. And that's it. Follow those simple 5 rules and you're gonna take better photos, I guarantee it. That being said, if you do have some extra money to spend, you can consider upgrading some of your gear, but it doesn't have to be expensive. My 2 spring lenses are, from a photography standpoint, dirt cheap. I use a Nikkor micro lens. It's a 40mm prime lens, and it's really good for getting close-up photos. And the other one I use is a Sigma 70-300 macro lens, and I use this to get those really distant shots. This lens is huge, but it was only about $225. You don't have to go out and spend thousands of dollars on lenses. But that being said, if you follow the free advice from this video, you'll take better photos regardless of what you're using, whether it's an iPhone or you're using your kit lenses on your Nikon D3300. So thank you for watching, and if you like what you've seen today, you can follow me on Instagram and you can watch my other videos. So get out there and get shooting, and see you soon.